What actually matters is obeying what God has said concerning this issue. So God calls abortion child sacrifice, calls it murder. It's crystal clear in his word, in the law and the prophets, what God thinks of that, how Christians should treat it in their laws and in their culture. And we should treat it like murder. We should protect babies inside the womb as the same way as people outside the womb. And there's no getting around that.
Ben, thank you so much for joining me on Of Flames and Crowns. You and I have known each other for a few years at this point, but it's fun to actually get closer over time and to have this conversation finally. I've really been looking forward to this conversation, so thank you for joining me today.
Yes, certainly good to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So, Ben, you're in the world of a lot of things. You're a journalist, I think, by profession, and you recently have this new book, Forsakers of the Fatherless, which is a fascinating read. I think such an important book for people to grasp and really understand the arguments that you put forward. I want to just backtrack here and ask, where did this specific interest in combating abortion come from? Where did this all begin for you?
Yeah, so when I started college at the University of Pennsylvania, I'd grown up for 18 years in the Christian home. And, that first year of college was in many ways me making my faith my own, or really Christ finding me and, coming to, I think, a true saving faith that year. And a lot of those same students who brought me to faith just by their example of being a young person in the word and knowledge of the word, they were also very interested in the abortion issue. They were ministering at Planned Parenthood here in Philadelphia. And one of them had a debate on campus with a bunch of pro-choicers, basically. That was one of my first exposures to the intellectual climate at Penn. So kind of adapting from them and just seeing firsthand the abortion holocaust in America. So going to the abortion mill, seeing babies getting murdered in the city in which I was living, that was very impactful for me. So when I started writing for conservative news outlets, so Daily Wire, the Spectator, outlets like that, abortion was definitely top of mind. So I went to school for business and business economics report at Daily Wire for a couple of years, but also had an eye toward the abortion issue, toward evangelicalism in America, things like that. But that just grew and grew over time. Continuing to go down to the abortion mills and minister and talk to moms and dads trying to murder their babies. And it's just impossible to ignore in a lot of ways. When you see it with your own eyes and you see it thousands, hundreds of thousands of times, it really impacts you. And that's sort of where I am today.
Yeah, that's so good. One of the things that many people might find controversial is your use of the term murder. Like I've had conversations with people, and I very intentionally use that word because that is exactly what's going on here. And yet some people are triggered by it and they're like, well, we don't have to call it murder. And I think that's their attempt to sort of appease or soothe over their troubled consciences to some degree. Is that something you had a struggle with initially, or from the get-go, did you always reckon with the fact that this is murder that we're talking about?
Right. Well, I grew up in an evangelical home, grew up in a Christian home, so I always knew abortion was wrong, knew it was pro-life, knew that abortion was murder. My parents did a great job of just teaching me and my siblings that, taking the life of a baby inside the womb is no different from taking the life of a person outside the womb. So that wasn't a particularly hard, bar to cross for me. But there's tremendous power in calling a thing what it is what I've learned over the years. So instead of euthymizing abortion, using, termination of a pregnancy, terms like that, it's much more useful to say it's murder. It's killing a person, killing an innocent person in an unjustified manner. We can leave it at that. And, the truth has that piercing effect, like Hebrews says, the word of God cuts between the division of bone and marrow. And just the truth in God's world in general does that. So on this issue, that's no exception.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So, of course, Ben, some of my background and the fact that before I was here, I lived in Zambia. And you might be interested to know that, abortion has actually been legal in Zambia since 1972, right? Like this is pre-Roe. And Planned Parenthood have been in that part of the world for just as long. It kind of shows you that Margaret Sanger's shadow is long, and she was very serious about her project in eugenics, and this is true across the African continent. I think today my friends and I actually estimate somewhere between 1.5 million to 2 million abortions done every single year. And this is in a country that has a population of 20 million people. So that's a very significant percentage of a country's population being murdered every single year. And it's when I started to see the numbers several years ago that my interest in this subject was certainly piqued. And I knew that something needed to be done. I knew that I needed to lend my voice to this all-important subject. Now, in the way that you've approached it, what you're seeking to put forward is this idea of abolition, abortion abolition. And I want to get into some of the weeds of this just so people can really understand what you're talking about here. You had Dusty Devers write your foreword. And it was a profound foreword. It's actually one of the best forewords I've seen for a book, I must say. And I love Dusty. He's a phenomenal gentleman. And he highlights 5 core tenets of abortion abolition, which the first one being gospel-centered, second one aligned providentially, third one through the church, engaged biblically, and the fifth sought immediately without exception or compromise. So I just kind of want to work through these just so people actually get an understanding of what you mean when you talk about abortion abolition. So let's start with gospel-centered. In your understanding of this, what does this mean to be gospel-centered in our approach towards abortion abolition?
Certainly, yeah. So if you look at the historic church, everywhere Christians go in the world, we overturn child sacrifice, infanticide, abortion, euthanasia, you name it. So Dr. George Grant, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has a great book called Third Time Around, which details the Christian history of doing that, where the gospel compels us to love neighbor as ourselves. It's a natural outworking of transformed hearts, hearts to understand that we've been forgiven by Christ, by his death and resurrection, that he loved us unto death, and we should love our neighbors in the same way. So that natural outflow of the gospel has a profound impact on any culture it enters. So, but also addressing the exact sin of abortion with the gospel. There are millions of people in our nation, men and women, who have gone through with abortions, who have helped others obtain abortions, and they need gospel hope. They need to know that there is a savior on the other end of what they've done. They've murdered an innocent person, their own child, but God forgives murderers. Christ forgives murderers. He took murder to that cross and he put it in the grave, and it's not going to rise again for those who repent and believe in him. So ultimately, the deep wounds in our culture, on an individual level, on a corporate level, can only be healed by the gospel. So if you look at how pro-life groups usually approach it, it's with, secular appeals, reasoning that not everybody sees the Bible as their authority, therefore we shouldn't try to use it as our primary authority. So they appeal to science, to philosophy, to data in God's world. There's certainly a place for that, but it's not sufficient to actually deal with the spiritual crisis that is abortion in our nation. It's ultimately not a political crisis, a cultural crisis. It's a spiritual crisis. It flows from our apostasy, from the sexual revolution, all the things that we've been doing in the West to rebel against God. So we need to be called back to God through his son, Jesus Christ.
So well said, Ben. I've spent time outside abortion mills, and it's difficult to really put this into words, but other than you can tell pretty head on that this is a spiritual thing that we're dealing with here. The fundamental problem is not that people don't have money or that people are really suffering. It's that people are not right with Jesus Christ. Like, that's what it boils down to. They seek to persist in their sin and their rebellion. And that's why I love this gospel-centered approach, because it actually gets to the heart of the matter. The problem here is sin. The problem here is disobedience and rebellion and unbelief, and just blatant evil. In fact, that's really what we're dealing with here, blatant evil. And the only solution to that blatant evil is the person and work of Jesus Christ. I think there's just no way getting around that. If we're really going to see abortion ended, it has to begin with people bending the knee to Jesus Christ in absolutely every way, and seeking to live lives of repentance. There's just no way around that. The second core tenet here, Ben, is aligned providentially. What does that mean? How do you flesh that out?
Certainly. So maybe it's useful again to compare that to the approach to the pro-life establishment over the past several decades, where instead of providence, it's been pragmatism, saying, what do we think will work best in our culture to chip away at abortion? So whether that's heartbeat bills, whether that's, bills that say, just bury your baby after you murder it, ultrasound bills that say, just look at your baby before you murder it. there's all sorts of regulations we can come up with that seem good, and maybe they do save some babies to some extent. Probably not as many as we think they do, but maybe to some extent. But far and beyond that, what actually matters is obeying what God has said concerning this issue. So God calls abortion child sacrifice, calls it murder. It's crystal clear in his word, in the law and the prophets, what God thinks of that, how Christians should treat it in their laws and in their culture. And we should treat it like murder. We should protect babies inside the womb as the same way as people outside the womb. And there's no getting around that. And I think what a lot of these incremental measures have done is really delay that process of immediate abolition, of actually abolishing abortion. We've had abortion in this nation for now over 50 years. We're 3 years post Roe with the Dobbs decision, and yet there's still abortions in every single state of the country, and there's still legal loopholes allowing women to murder their babies. It's just a complete mess, and a lot of that is because there hasn't been that Christian witness relying on God's providence and saying we're going to obey Him and leave the results to Him. And the easy thing to do is to look at the circumstances on the ground and say, well, it's very unlikely that we're going to actually succeed in that. But, fast forward, or actually reverse, 150, 200 years, and the slavery abolitionists are probably facing the same objections, saying, the slave trade is so entrenched into our economy. It's so critical to, in Britain, our competition with France on the global stage. Nobody's ever going to want to actually get rid of it. And yet, look what happened. We're over 150 years post-slavery in the Western world. So, God hates these practices. God hates child sacrifice, hates slavery, all these public evils. And when Christians actually walk in the paths of trying to obey Him concerning opposing them, He tends to bless those efforts.
Yeah, very well said. Ben, it's interesting. I mean, like you've referenced Dobbs here and the fact that we're 3 years past Roe, and that is something that we can wholeheartedly celebrate, the Dobbs decision. In the grand scheme of things, do you think things are better or worse for it? Do you think, where does the rest of the work need to take place now, as you're trying to frame all this? I think there's some people who, because of the Dobbs decision, would think, yeah, we've won. That's pretty much all we needed to do. The most important thing was to make sure that we took abortion out of the hands of the federal government, bring it back to a state level. Just what's your summary? What's your understanding of just the fallout from all of this? What's your commentary on Dobbs 3 years removed from it?
Certainly, yeah. So Roe, the overturn of Roe was definitely good. Roe was obviously an unjust decision. It was,
right,
the means by which, babies were murdered for almost 50 years in this country. And that was often the excuse that lawmakers were using for why they couldn't abolish abortions, because, well, we have Dobbs, we have to work under we have Roe, we have to work under the Roe paradigm, we have no other choice. And then Roe was overturned, and yet somehow those states still have abortions. So we just did a press release a few weeks ago at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion showing that there were over 250,000, or I think about 250,000 abortions in red states that claim they've banned abortion. And that's in comparison to about 180,000 in 2019. So the last year before COVID and before Dobbs. So those two big disruptions. So obviously the abortion issue has not been addressed. There's still abortion pills. Just because you shut down the abortion clinics doesn't mean the pills stop flowing. Nationwide, I think we're up to over 1.1 million abortions. That's still much more than under the last years of Roe.
Wow.
So of course, overturning Roe was great. That was the right thing to do, but Dobbs didn't go nearly far enough. So actually, in just recent days, you had Amy Coney Barrett defending that decision and saying that, well, we turned it over to the democratic process, right? The problem is democracy in a nation where everybody loves child sacrifice is not going to work out very well for babies in the womb, in the same way that, if you give foxes the vote onto how many hens are eaten out of the hen house, it's not going to look very good for hens. That's just the culture we live in, and it's a wicked culture, and that needs to be dealt with. But really the solution lies in, every level of government, from like R.C. Sproul said, the dog catcher up to the Supreme Court. They need to obey God and actually align themselves with the 14th Amendment, right, which is a good expression of saying, all persons should receive equal protection of the laws. So that aligns with the principles of God's word and recognizing the humanity of preborn babies. So whether, you're a Supreme Court justice, a red state lawmaker, a blue state lawmaker, you should be seeking to pass and enact laws, court opinions, statutes that align with that standard.
Yeah, I think that's profoundly said. I mean, your remark on democracy is profound and I think so necessary. I often like to define democracy as the ability for people to choose their tyranny. Democracy has proved in essence, impotent to actually shape a civilization towards righteousness. It's never been done before. It's never been realized before. And that's because man has this natural proclivity towards sin. And so if there is a general consensus that the murder of unborn children is agreeable, then you're going to have mass murder as we've had it. In fact, there's a sense in which what we see today is democracy playing itself out. And it's catastrophic. We're talking about millions of children, tens of millions of children being murdered in the womb every year because of this. Interesting that you bring up the 14th Amendment. And just like the point is, we have a constitution that recognizes this idea of equal protection. And yet it seems that there are many legislators who aren't willing to adhere to the law of the land. Like, is that a fair way of putting it? Like, and what's your understanding of why they're so flippant about the law in a sense? If the 14th Amendment stipulates that so plainly, why do we still see the carnage that we see today? Shouldn't there be more contention on this point? It seems like that seems to be lacking to some degree. Just any thoughts around that?
Certainly, yeah. So there's actually a section on our website at Foundation to Abolish Abortion that has to do with oaths of office. So you can look at every single state's oath of office, and the vast majority, if not all of them, require an oath to the Constitution, to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And so every lawmaker who's refusing to apply 14th Amendment protections to preborn children in the jurisdictions are out of alignment with their own oaths. So regardless of the political circumstances, if they take that oath, they have to abide by it. They're going to be held accountable by God on the last day for adhering to their oath, as we all will for all of our words. So yeah, there's just a complete dereliction of that. I remember reading in the Westminster Confession just about oaths and vows and things like that, and there's just been a loss of that value in our culture of our words actually meaning something. I suspect the vast majority of lawmakers, when they enter into office, they're not really thinking deeply about what they're committing to. They just know that they have this new opportunity to do what they want, to maybe gain opportunities for themselves, do what seems right to them, without really a thought as to what they're committing themselves to do, which ultimately is to obey God in their office. We know from the Bible too that every lawmaker is a deacon of God, as Romans 13 says, a minister of God for justice. And yet so many of those lawmakers are refusing to establish justice for especially preborn children, a host of other issues too, doing all sorts of wickedness, allowing wickedness to continue in this country. So really, it's just like you were saying with democracy, it's just, the erosion of that value within our people. So I think the people that we elect to office represent us very well in that we're an immoral people, and we're increasingly so, that doesn't really care what God says. And we're seeing the fruit of that constantly.
Yeah, that's so profound. Not too long ago, Ben, I had the opportunity to visit the Capitol, and I got to see Congress. And in the gallery, you have all these lawmakers over history, and all of them are turning to the side, looking to the next person, looking back over history in order to get to what they contributed to history. And the only figure who's actually looking forward is Moses. And his image literally hangs over, or at least it's facing the front part of the entire room. And I find that remarkably profound. There's this understanding that law comes from God, and as stipulated specifically in his word. And I find this interesting that it's in the halls where the lawmakers gather together to actually come up with the laws that are going to govern this nation. And yet they seem to fail to recognize where law comes from and what it looks like to actually be just and enable the kinds of laws that allow for life and freedom and fruitfulness. And so, yeah, just as you're saying that's a vivid picture that comes to mind, and it's what we see today is almost making a mockery of law, and specifically God's law. That needs to change. Another tenet here that's referenced is this idea of through the church. How would you explain this specific tenet?
Certainly, yeah. So for a very long time, we sort of outsourced the work of ending abortion to these nonprofit organizations, to political lobbying groups, and there's a place for that. But I think we sort of use that to advocate our responsibility. So for most of my life, that's what I did. I thought that the extent to which I needed to oppose abortion was, participate in my church's baby bottle campaign every single year. Scrape together like $8 in pocket change and put it in the in the church hallway in January, and that was my contribution for the year. And attend a pro life gala once in a while, cut a check, things like that. I think that's kind of the mindset we've settled into. Really, I think that the vision that the scriptures give us is that we're supposed to be opposing it ourselves. It's going to look different for every person, but you have to reckon with texts like Proverbs 24:11 and 12, where
Yes.
God says, "Rescue those being taken away in death; hold back those who are stumbling to the slaughter." If you say, "Did not know this," does not he who weighs your heart perceive it? Will he not judge man according to his works? That sort of very urgent moral duty that God puts on not just some Christians, but really to some extent all Christians. And again, it's going to look different for everybody. We have to all reckon with that. And really, it's supposed to be the church that's salt and light in our nation. So so when the church is silent on abortion, you just see it continue, and that's the case for a number of other practices too. But really, the fact that abortion has been so prevalent in our country is because the church has been silent. We believe that the lies of the seeker sensitive movement saying that convicting sinners and converting sinners is somehow mutually exclusive is just not true. You need both, and that also leads to a lack of discipleship among Christians, even the most sound Christians who are in the sort of average American church. Just not really aware of biblical life ethics, of theology of civil government, and how to actually oppose evil in our world. And we're seeing the fruit of a derelict church constantly. So I think in many ways the answer is the church, just the broad people of God in this country repenting and saying this needs to be priority number one for us in our public engagement, not holding back, not being afraid to say abortion is murder, things like that.
Right.
But just being willing to stand firmly on God's truth, and like we were talking about earlier with providence, just trusting Him with the results.
So well said, Ben. I firmly believe that the state of the culture is the resume of the church. I think where we see the kind of chaos that we see in the world, it's not a stretch to infer that the church, through their apathy and perhaps their ignorance and just their general compromise, has discipled the nations in this chaos. And that's where everything needs to begin. The church is the pillar and ground of truth in society. And for as long as they're compromised, the rest of the culture is going to be compromised as well. And I think you're right in pointing out to the seeker-sensitive movement, which was all about trying to get the world to like us. Because I think the understanding was we can only win people to Christ and to righteousness if they like us as Christians. And I'm like, well, that's not really in keeping with how we understand Christianity to go against a world that actually hates God. If they hate your Christ, they're likely going to hate you too. But we win them not by being like them, but actually by being a people who are set apart and holy in doing that work. So yeah, Ben, I mean, I really do share your desire to see the church return to its truth and orthodoxy in that sense, and really being the salt and light in this world. A fourth tenet here that's referenced is engaged biblically. Unpack this for us. What does this refer to specifically?
Certainly, yeah. So God is not silent on the issue of child sacrifice on abortion. So our opposition needs to flow from the Bible first and foremost. So rather than merely looking to the truth of God's world, which is definitely out there, right? So biology, we can talk about human conception and fertilization, know about those things, but really as Bradley Pierce, our president of the Foundation to Abolish Abortion, says, it boils down to who says, right? It's the same question that little kids ask on the playground when they try to use an authority claim, like mom says we need to come in from recess. Who says? It's because of mom's authority or the teacher's authority, whatever the case may be. Really, we can prove up and down that abortion is murder, that babies in the womb are human from conception. And people are just going to say, and we've seen it more and more in recent years, yeah, sure, it's murder. It's just my right to murder my baby trumps that baby's right to life. So becoming more and more honest about that. So really, it boils down to who says. The one who says that is the God of the universe who created us, who will judge us on the last day, and who died for sinners, for those who have gone through with that to receive forgiveness in his name. So that's ultimately what matters. And you can't get there without the Bible. I remember hearing a really helpful analogy of the Bible is like, our nuclear weapon. So, we approach this war with a nuclear weapon. And so the ultimate play from the enemy is to try to get us to, put away the launch button, basically. And if you're facing an enemy with a nuclear weapon, of course, that's what you're going to do. That's your best bet. And we foolishly bought into that. We've said, all right, sure, I'll lay down my greatest and best weapon and try to fight you on your turf, when really we have this trump card that we've just refused to use. And we have to be willing to wield the Bible. It's the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And we've just laid down our weapons, and that's why we keep losing battles, because we're laying down our greatest weapon, our authority that's not ours, but that comes from God in His word.
Yeah, I think that's so well said. I think one of the most important phrases that I think Christians ought to employ in their apologetics is that "by what standard?" question. It's so important, and the Bible really does provide us the only standard for truth, for righteousness. And the interesting thing is, I think everyone sort of presupposes a standard. The only question is that standard actually truthful? Is it actually absolute? Is it objective? And because God is who He is, and because He's the only God of the universe, His word is the only all authoritative, all sufficient, inerrant word that we all should be subservient to. So I think that's so powerful. The fifth and final tenet here, and this one we could probably spend a little bit more time unpacking, but it's this idea of sought immediately without exception or compromise. How would you explain what that is? What does this refer to specifically?
Yes. So this is probably the biggest point of contention, at least right now, among believers who actually do want to end abortion. Can we pursue incremental regulations on abortion, or must we pursue immediate abolition? So we're recording this in early September. I don't know when it's going to come out, but in late October, there's going to be a debate in your neck of the woods in Moscow, Idaho, between Bradley Pierce, Jeff Durbin, and then also Doug Wilson and Toby Sumter on this exact question. Like, do we need to actually oppose abortion, seek to abolish abortion immediately, or are we allowed to do incremental regulations on the way to abolishing abortion? Mm-hmm. But again, it flows from the last tenet of Bible-driven, sought biblically, where, what does God require of us? He doesn't require of us. You don't see the sort of regulations that a lot of pro-life groups impose in the Bible. It doesn't come naturally from the text. It comes from human pragmatism. It comes from what we think will work. If you look at what God actually requires of us as His image bearers in terms of how we treat the murder of babies in the womb, it's treated like murder. Treated like murder, no less or no more than that. Treat babies in the womb the same as you would treat people outside the womb. Love your neighbor as yourself. That sort of value. And also explicit texts against incremental regulations or half measures or partiality in judgment. So there's Isaiah 10, there's Psalm 94, these texts that exhort the people, civil magistrates as well. Psalm 94 especially deals with that. That enshrining iniquity into the law is actually a wicked and abominable thing to do. So, you also see in Proverbs, unequal weights and measures are both like an abomination to the Lord. So God speaks very strongly about these sorts of regulations, or half measures in His word, and He clearly doesn't like it. So the question is going to be, maybe we have a good motive to start out with. We want to save some babies, we want to do what's politically possible in our own eyes. We could do that, or we could just trust the Lord and keep coming back with the exact same, standard that He's upholding, and trust Him with the results. And I think the latter in history has worked, as we talked about earlier. The slave trade, that's how it was abolished. And, that's the sort of method that we can expect God to bless over time in a nation like ours.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. And I guess a question that I'm sure many people would have is, is there room for an incremental approach to this? Some people might argue that Dobbs, for example, was an incremental measure toward abortion abolition. And so people then would employ a more incrementalist approach, not because they believe in incrementalism as an end in itself, but toward abolition. I suppose in your framework, is there room to see steady progress? Perhaps you begin with outlawing abortion at a federal level, then you do it at a state level. Like, is there room for that? And especially with the way America's political system is structured, where you kind of have to work through various phases in order for something to be widespread and whole scale. I suppose, what are your thoughts on incrementalism from that perspective?
Yeah, certainly. And I think maybe I can clarify just based on that. By immediatism, I don't mean overnightism. I don't mean abortion must end, from Tuesday to Wednesday, overnight. It's over and there's zero abortions happening. We're humans. We're bound by limitations in time and space, by geography. by our state boundaries is a good example of that. So you can abolish abortion in Texas without doing it in Oklahoma immediately as well. It's just how we're bound by, as creatures. Talking about the slave trade, William Wilberforce had a bill to abolish the slave trade, and then slavery happened 2 decades later. So we're allowed to do single subject bills that don't try to abolish all evils all at once. We can just deal with abortion and just remove partiality from the laws concerning murder. But when it comes to actually deciding between which babies live and die in our laws that we're proposing, that's the sort of thing that I think Scripture condemns. So there's a great talk that Bradley Pierce gave about this called "Are Increments Okay?" is the title of the talk. So it can be found on YouTube. That really dives into this issue. But that's just the nature of how we are. Is we do deal incrementally as finite creatures, but incrementalism is a different question. It's the advocacy of change by degrees is what we would encourage against, and say that no, you should encourage immediate abolition.
Okay, very interesting. And of course, a lot of the way that you frame this and your book specifically, and by the way, we should give a special shout out to Founders Press for actually picking this up. I think they're the ones publishing your book. I've got good friends there, and they're doing phenomenal work too. But in this book, a lot of the framing, and we've kind of touched on this slightly, but I want us to get into this in more detail, is basically the compromise from the pro-life movement. So your book very profoundly gives various scenarios in various states across the country where there were efforts to propose and push bills of equal protection. And initially, it seemed like those bills were picking up steam and gaining some traction, only to be shut down by pro-life lobbyists who didn't want that bill of equal protection. Do you want to just elaborate on that? What is this compromise of the pro-life movement, and why are they doing this? Why does it seem like they are sabotaging efforts toward equal protection?
Certainly, yeah. So the reason I wrote the book is because a lot of these pro-life groups are not only refusing to pursue the end of abortion, but are actively obstructing it, which is the really shocking element. That's the secret treachery of the pro-life establishment, as the subtitle of the book says. So you see this pattern arise throughout the book, and in every single one of the chapters that I wrote, is there's Christians who are raised up to oppose abortion. They realize that it has to end legislatively. It's a matter for the civil magistrate to deal with at the end of the day. So they bring that admonition to their lawmakers, and they're opposed not by Planned Parenthood, by the Democrats, by the pro-choice lobby, but often by the pro-life lobby, by the longtime pro-life leaders in their states who are Mr. or Mrs. Pro-life in Oklahoma or Texas or Missouri, states like that. And we're paying these people, we think, over the course of several decades to actually bring an end to abortion. But it turns out, just by their own admission, they're not really trying to do that. They're trying to end abortion without, just recognizing that it's broadly bad, without actually treating it like murder, without criminalizing it, which ultimately is what we need to do in order to actually end it. So you see them just arguing tooth and nail in the public square and privates that actually treating abortion like murder is wrong for various reasons. Maybe it's too politically risky. Maybe it penalizes mothers, right? So there's this big debate about the second victim narrative, and are moms who willfully going through with abortion, are they actually victims of abortion, or are they willful murderers who are taking the lives of their own children? And the pro-life leaders take that former stance, saying, no, all mothers always are victims of abortion. And we would say that's ludicrous. Of course, their mothers, the vast majority of abortions, the moms are willfully involved in it, or they're initiating it, or they're pursuing it themselves. So those are the sort of oppositions we see across the country when we try to actually end abortion. It's not so much from the pro-life lobby, especially in these red states, right? A lot of the states in the book are not Democrat states. They're red states where the abortion lobby has no power, and yet the pro-life establishment has filled that gap of being the actual party that's obstructing the end of abortion.
Yeah, I mean, when you describe it that way, that is just so bizarre to me. And I want to get into some of the weeds here a little bit. For example, that argument that women are always victims. It took me 5 minutes in an abortion mill the first time I went out to discover that that's really not the case. Many of the women that I spoke to walking into abortion clinics are women who wanted to be able to have sex with no consequences. They wanted to be able to live a licentious lifestyle without having the responsibility of looking after a child, for example. I've met young girls, 15, 16-year-old girls, this is very much the case. It's not because for the vast majority, it's not because they landed into some trouble accidentally and now they've got no options. They have a clear understanding of what's going on, most of the ones that I talk to, but they still would go ahead with it. And what they do is try to soothe over their consciences of doing so. Ben, to what degree, that argument that women are all as victims, to what degree is this a consequence of feminism having infiltrated the pro-life movement that wants to, in a sense, almost deify women, as if women can never sin, as if women can never really commit atrocious acts of evil? How much of this do you see as a consequence of feminism?
Yeah, a lot of pro-life groups have definitely bought the feminist lie, hook, line, and sinker. You can look no further than their public profiles on social media, and they're talking about, how, true feminists are pro-life and things like that. And you can see what they're trying to do. They're trying to build a big tent. They're trying to be winsome in the culture. But really, you're obstructing the central focus, which must be, justice for the baby, saving babies, ending abortion for their behalf. And of course, we want to take care of mothers, but really, ultimately, it's oftentimes the mothers who are going through with the abortion in the first place. You also see a lot of toxic empathy, emotional sabotage, whatever word you want to describe it as, with that, where you take the really compelling example of the mother who's, maybe abused physically and forced into an abortion by an abuser, by a sex trafficker, by a pimp, whatever the case may be. And then you overextend that to all the rest of the cases. So in the same way that, pro-choicers take rape and incest and those really heartbreaking examples, and they pretend like that's the vast majority of abortions or use it to justify the rest of them, you see that with the pro-life groups where they take those edge cases of true coercion and duress toward abortion, and they use it to excuse the rest of the women who know what they're doing, though maybe are on their second or third abortion and are still murdering their child. So it starts from a good place of wanting to be compassionate in many cases, right? Wanting to have empathy for that mother, but really gets over applied. And as Dr. Rigney says, you get untethered from reality in that process, and you start to deny what you actually should be affirming, which is justice for the fatherless, which is, the fact that abortion just shouldn't be legal. It should be treated like murder in our culture. And when you use those that misplaced and untethered compassion, empathy, you lose that emphasis entirely. You become completely misgrounded. You become adrift in that stream of wherever you're going to be brought by the culture is where you're going to end up.
Ben, my next question here might come off very cynical, but I think it does need to be asked. Do you think that there is a chance that pro-life movements who would be against equal protection bills aren't interested in seeing abortion ended? Because there's this entire industry, pro-life industry, that gives them jobs and a living. In that sense, it's a multi-million-dollar industry that really, sure, I guess the net positive of it is it does help a lot of people. But by and large, there's this resistance to equal protection. I wonder if that could be because they'd rather keep their jobs than actually see abortion ended. I ask it as a cynical question, but as a genuine question as well, because I want to get to the root of this. Like, why? Why is it? Do they really want to see abortion ended? What's actually going on here? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, to butcher a quote from, I believe, Upton Sinclair, he said, you can never actually show a man something that his salary is going to convince him the other way toward. So when somebody's making money under a certain thesis or from a certain institution or receives the benefit, the credibility from a certain institution, they're going to be very unwilling to actually question the institution's core assumptions about things. So that's, the pro-life movement is no exception. So for 50 plus years, if the whole movement has assumed that women are victims of abortion, then nobody's going to want to question that because that puts them at risk. And you see this intense backlash toward abolitionists because we're questioning essential, basically religious commitment or dogma from those organizations that has just defined the pro-life movement for so long. And if they turn away from that, they lose all sorts of credibility. So in the same way that, you look at Big Eva, you look at a lot of these massive institutions on the right, if you start to question, some of their assumptions, you don't really engage in a good debate because those institutional leaders are just going to reject the threats of their power, basically. And even though it happens under Christian or conservative auspices, it doesn't really matter because humans are still humans. And to answer your question about finances, so I did look at a couple of 990 reports from big pro-life groups, and there are definitely pro-life leaders who make a decent amount of money. So $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 a year. That's definitely a substantial salary. I think there are better scams to run than taking money from pro-life grandmas who are on fixed incomes and using it to pay your own salary. So I don't know if it's everybody who's in the pro-life establishment is in it for the cash. Probably some, but I think an equally compelling explanation is just pride. You were using these past several decades of your life to advance these really at the end of the day, useless regulations on abortion. And now at the end of your life, when you're 70 years old, and you're hearing about this abolition thing for the first time, and maybe some compelling points about why that strategy just didn't really work in the first place, you're going to be very unwilling to look back at your life's work and say, yeah, this is actually deeply mistaken in a lot of ways. So because humans are human and institutions work the way they work on the right, I think that's a big explanation for why we are where we are today.
Yeah. Do you think that for as long, do you think that there could be any success in pushing equal protection bills while the pro-life lobby still exists? Are there places where you're optimistic that something could still happen, or is it one of those situations where for as long as the pro-life lobby exists, your work at Foundation to Abolish Abortion, End Abortion Now in Arizona, can these institutions really be successful while the pro-life lobby frustrates many of these plans?
Certainly, yeah. So it makes it a lot harder for sure. But I think you're starting to see the pro-life establishment lose credibility on this question. So we're getting more and more bill sponsors across the country every single year. So I remember reporting on these bills, 4 or 5 years ago at Daily Wire, and most of these bills would just have like maybe 1 or 2 or 3 sponsors. Now we're up to 10, 20 sponsors for a single bill in a certain state. And you're seeing the pro-life establishment starting to be self-conscious about their opposition toward this position. So a good example is Missouri. So earlier this year, Bradley Pierce and I were in Missouri testifying for an abolition bill. And in past years, the same 2 or 3 pro-life leaders would show up and testify against our bills, and they were nowhere to be found this year. And that because they weren't there, the committee actually took a vote, and a decent number of Republicans voted for that bill. It didn't pass; they weren't quite enough, but there was progress. To my knowledge, an abolition bill in Missouri hadn't received a vote before, and had barely received a committee hearing in the past. But this year, it was different, and it's because those pro-life groups just weren't there. And it's not because they lost any money or power. It's just because they didn't want to go on the record yet again as opposing a bill to end abortion, I think is what it boiled down to. So the extent to which abolitionists, just Christians, are raising the alarm about this issue of pro-life groups obstructing the end of abortion, the more and more they're going to be taking a step back from being as vocal toward their opposition, and we might see some more ground being gained.
Yeah, that's very encouraging. Are you seeing a lot of people in the pro-life lobby embracing abolitionism over time? Is that something you're seeing on the ground?
Yeah, there's definitely some. So a good example is Abby Johnson. So she's not a full-blown abolitionist, but she's Roman Catholic, but she's adopted equal protection, so recognizing that we have to actually protect babies under the law the same as born people. She's rejected the second victim narrative. She herself is a post-abortive mother. Twice she's had 2 abortions, and she's been willing to publicly say, I was not a victim. I had to take this to the cross and receive forgiveness for this. But there's definitely examples like that. Even those who aren't openly saying I was wrong. I was wrong to oppose these bills. I'm going to shift my tactics now. There are some who are starting to play the word games with the abolitionists. So a good example is Marjorie Daniels-Felser, the president of Susan B. Anthony Pro-Life America, so arguably the most powerful pro-life group in the country. She had a talk recently in Iowa where she said, we need equal protection of the laws for preborn children. We need a presidential candidate in 2028 who's going to run on that platform. So she's hearing the chatter, and she's recognizing that her group needs to shift and adapt to that narrative. And, it's because, again, just standing on the truth of God's word, a very small minority of Christians have been able to shift that whole conversation on the right concerning abortion, being that thorn in their side in many cases for the pro-life groups, and making them reckon with this position. That's been sufficient to start to steer the ship over time. And Lord willing, that'll only continue.
Yeah, so good. So Ben, you wrote this book, Forsakers of the Fatherless. What are you hoping this book is going to do? What kind of thought and action are you hoping this book will inspire?
Certainly, yeah. So as we were talking about toward the beginning, we all have a role to play. It's going to look different for everybody. Not everybody's going to be lobbying in their state house. Not everybody's going to be on the sidewalk doing sidewalk ministry.
Mhm.
But everybody has a role to play. Every Christian who names the name of Christ and says they love their neighbors as themselves has some form of a role to play in opposing abortion in our culture. So my hope for the book is that we would recognize that a lot of those who are claiming to do that aren't actually doing that, but then also, more importantly, finding other believers who are actually serious about that, actually abolishing abortion, not just regulating it, getting together with them, seeing the examples in the book of Christians who have done that sort of thing, been convicting themselves and started their own efforts, but also found others in their states that are doing the same thing. So my hope is that, Lord willing, millions of Christians across the country will read that book and see that can be done. Everyday people can oppose abortion with the power of the gospel. And
Mm.
most of the people in that book are not rich or powerful. They're just everyday people.
Right.
Couple of pastors, others who just are normal individuals, aren't even vocational ministers, but just have that calling on their life and recognize God's commands in that area. So my hope is that more Christians look at those examples, see their brothers and sisters doing that, and follow suit.
Yeah, I want people to actually read the book. It is a brilliant read. I left very encouraged after reading it. Do you have a specific favorite story or just character that stands out for you as a good model that people could find great encouragement and inspiration from?
Yeah, for sure. So there's several. It's hard to pick just one in the book,
Yeah.
but yeah, my friend Brian Gunter in Louisiana, that was my favorite chapter to write. I just love his heart for preborn children, and he's been so consistent with this over the course of his ministry. And just knowing him for a few years personally, you can tell he's so convicted by this and has this deep zeal to establish justice for the fatherless in this country. But I think he put it in some of the best possible ways in the book, because he actually was in the pro-life establishment. He worked part-time for Louisiana Right to Life, and he saw the errors and he turned away from them. And he said, there's a really compelling part in that chapter where he was saying, I was Mr. Pro-Life in Louisiana, and every time I slapped pro-life on a bill, it would just sail right through the legislature, and it didn't ask any questions. It said, all right, great, this is going to save babies, but then abortion just continues year after year, and he eventually realizes, no, this isn't actually working. These bills don't actually do anything. So I think folks looking at that example, that's a really excellent model for them to say, maybe question their presuppositions and say, are these efforts, are these groups that I'm supporting actually bringing an end to abortion? Maybe they saved a couple babies, but are they actually ending the institution of abortion in this country?
Yeah, so good. So Ben, we actually have several students and alumni who are involved in, opposing abortion in many aspects. We've got tons of students who volunteer year in, year out in some of our sidewalk ministries at Planned Parenthood, and that's been very encouraging to see. We have some alumni who've gone on to just do full-time work in opposing abortion as well. And there's more we want to do. I think New St. Andrews College is absolutely sold out for opposing abortion in every way, and which is why I think we're very excited to see a lot of the work that FAA is doing, and that's encouraging. But for students who might be watching this, what are some words of counsel that you'd give them in terms of how best they can be involved, where can they be most effective as they pursue their interests in opposing abortion in America?
For sure. Yeah. I think a big thing I had to realize in my own life was it's not enough to just consume content about this issue, right? So our temptation, especially as Reformed Christians who love to read books and love podcasts and those sorts of things, and I have a book and you have a podcast. So it's, it's not to say those things are bad, but it just can't end there. It has to actually extend our hands and feet. So like you said, whether it's just a volunteer position, doing sidewalk ministry, whether it's a full-time job, opposing abortion, it has to actually, translate into action. So often we talk a big game in terms of what our theology on this issue, or thinking right thoughts about it, but it actually just ends there. And it can't do that, or else no babies are going to be saved and abortion will never end. So, to the student that's out there listening, find some like-minded peers and go do something, figure out something to do, whether that's, spending the day in, is Boise your state capital in Idaho? Is it Boise?
Yeah, that's right. It's Boise.
Going down to Boise for the day and lobbying for a bill, finding the local Planned Parenthood and ministering there. Just get some believers together and do something about it. Don't let it just stop with words. Actually extend to your hands and feet.
Mm. Yeah, we actually have a few some alumni as well who are state legislators as well, and our part of our goal at NSA is to churn out cultural leaders who will go on and actually shape civilization as a whole, and we fully hope and anticipate that several of our graduates will go on and become legislators who will actually push the kind of bills that you and I are talking about, equal protection bills. And so I'm praying that that's something we'll see the fulfillment of sooner rather than later. Ben, to kind of just get into what I think is a very important angle in conversations around abortion is culture specifically. And I think you would agree with me that modern culture could be described as a culture of death in many ways. And so, we've already iterated the prevalence of the murder of the unborn, which is why you and I are talking today. But we also live in a culture that generally has an aversion towards children, very skeptical and spiteful towards children, which is why we want to murder them, have as few of them as possible, or just not have them at all. And I think that this is actually one of those areas where the church needs to be more forthright in its witness, in its embrace of children. And that's not to say it hasn't been. I think the church still exists as perhaps the only sense of sanity and hope in the world today on the backdrop of this culture of death. And yet we can also imbibe these attitudes about children that are very unhelpful. And so I guess I want your commentary on that. Like, to what degree do we need to be promoting a culture of fertility and fruitfulness where people love and embrace children, where people don't have this repulsive reaction to big families, for example? Do you have any thoughts on the necessity of that and how best we can cultivate this sort of attitude in the church?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, abortion is just one fruit of the sexual revolution. So it goes far beyond just, it's not like abortion just appeared out of the ether and suddenly a majority Christian culture, deeply Christian culture, decide one day we're going to murder our own children. There's a very long progression that got us to this point. Part of it has to do with, hating children. So, Jean-Jacques Rousseau was one of the first Enlightenment thinkers, and he famously gave up several of his own children just to the state orphanage system in France because it conflicted with his own autonomy and liberation, sexual liberation. So we have to actually, like you said, address the root issue of, we just hate children because they're burdensome, at least in our perspective, because they get in the way of what we actually want to do, which is consumption. And, we don't view them as blessings. We view them as burdens, as, a disruption to our life rather than our life actually starting when we start having them. And it's really sinister. And I think like you're mentioning, a really great way for Christians to oppose is just to have big families and be unapologetic about it and uphold it as a positive cultural good. I think, up there in Moscow, that's definitely embraced, and seeing it more and more across the country of, recognizing the goodness of children. Pastors definitely have a big role in that, in extolling just from the Bible, so many texts about, the goodness and the blessing of children, and not being willing to confront the materialistic presuppositions of our culture and saying that, children are a disruption to joy rather than, a wonderful source of it. So there's a number of ways that can be done, but I think that, as you mentioned, that's a great way to, beyond just legislation and things like that, just as a soft cultural matter, to actually preach to the culture by our own example and say, no, children are to be embraced, not rejected, especially not murdered.
Yeah, exactly. Very well said. Ben, I would like to believe that this conversation might attract interest from those who would be pro-abortion. And so just very briefly, I just want to hit on some very specific talking points and just get your responses to some things as an argument against very prevalent pro-abortion talking points. One of them being the low-hanging fruit here is the rape and incest. In cases of rape and incest, why doesn't that warrant abortion? Like, what's your direct response to that claim?
Right. We don't get to murder people because of the circumstances of their conception. So I know people who have been conceived in rape. I don't think you can murder them either. Right. They're, some of them are, 40, 50 years old, and they've lived a full and fruitful life despite the evil in which they brought into the world. And just because the way in which people were conceived doesn't mean that they're less valuable as human beings. I love that meme that you see sometimes of two ultrasound pictures hung up together and saying, can you identify which one was actually conceived in rape? And the answer is no, you can't, because they're the same. Beyond that, the circumstances of their conception, they're identical as image bearers. And we can extend it in a broad variety of ways. Even Christians who oppose IVF, for example, would say the babies conceived in IVF are valuable. Just because your parents sinned in some way and conceiving you, bringing you into the world, doesn't mean that your life is any less valuable. So when we actually confess with God that life begins at conception, that his image is valuable, that defines the rest of the ethic. And the rape and incest language is often used as that emotional sabotage tactic to try to excuse the vast majority of abortions. And pretty much every single pro-abort I've talked to, when that comes up, I've said, okay, if I give you those, that 2% of abortions that happen, will you give me the other 98% and let me ban the other 98% of elective abortions? They'll say, no, of course not. And then it becomes, well, it was never about rape and incest, was it? It was just because, that as a Christian, I care about women and whether or not they're abused. And that you basically weaponize that against me in my care for the vulnerable against me and trying to excuse the oppression of other vulnerable people. So I think Christians need to approach it from that sort of a light.
Very good. Another argument is, a woman has the right to do whatever she wants with her body. How do you respond to that?
Right. Yeah. So at one level, it's, the body inside your body is not your body. It's a distinct human being inside the womb. You are not sovereign over that other person's body. God is. And really, that's what it boils down to. Like 1 Corinthians says, glorify God with your body. You're not your own. You're bought with a price. And, that's true of all of us as creatures, that we're clay molded by the potter. So we don't get to choose what we do with ourselves. God actually has a moral law that we're bound to as his creatures, especially his image bearers, to obey. And that's doubly true for those who are redeemed. So both by creation and redemption, Christians have a high calling for sexual purity, for sexual ethics. But really, we're not our own. That's something that sinful, fallen people do not like to hear, is that we don't belong to ourselves, that we're accountable to our maker and one day our judge. And that's what it boils down to is, we don't get to just murder other people because we feel like it, or it conflicts with our autonomy, even our bodily autonomy. Ultimately, we have to obey God in all things, including that area.
That's good. What about financial reasons? One of the things that I came across very often in Africa was this financial argument, especially. In fact, some of the ways that I saw it being framed directly was that poverty persists because of high fertility rates. And basically what many pro-abortion lobbyists would be aiming to do is promote this idea that if you have one less child, and then you will have a much higher chance of escaping poverty, to some degree. So you see that being pushed in that part of the world by entities like Planned Parenthood, or Marie Stopes is another very big one in Africa. But how do you respond to that? Because that's one that comes up all the time. Like many women can't afford it. You've got young families that can't afford it. How do you respond to that assertion?
Right. So here in America, I'm sure that you're thinking this too. I heard one abolitionist say one time, you can get a bingo card and put luxury car brands, BMW, Lexus, Mercedes-Benz, and just wait outside an abortion mill. And you'll be able to check off all of those boxes as women and men pull up to murder their children. So in America, it's not really a wealth issue. We're the wealthiest society in the history of the world. There's Christians who love to, give charitably to mothers who are in need. But even just more broadly across the world, even in places like Africa, I've been to Kenya a couple of times, and definitely there's a lot of poverty there. But still, those cultures embrace children as blessings, and they say, these children are wealth, they're assets. And I think that's how we ought to view children as Christians, especially is. It's like arrows in your quiver, man. Like it's, that's how God describes them is, that is the way in which he gives you to continue your name in the world and therefore his name in the world. That's what he told our first parents in the garden is, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. And if we view children that way, as assets, not liabilities, then we'll start to see all these things rightly. And I think a lot of countries around the world, the United States included, but especially in Europe, especially in East Asia, are learning the hard way that when you view children as liabilities, as large populations as liabilities that destroy your civilization, you actually do go extinct as a nation. So exactly. South Korea, Japan, Italy, France, they're just not replacing themselves, and they're collapsing in all sorts of ways, from government subsidy programs to just the strength of their economies, because they bought into this lie saying that we need to reduce our populations to save the climate, to improve our standards of living, whatever the case may be. And that is completely false. It's not. It's just not true. We've learned it the hard way. And we ought to, but then that translates into, as an individual person or couple, you have to actually recognize that for yourselves and say, will I be more happy in 50 years if I have, one child, or if I have 10? And most of the time it's going to be 10. And of course, that God's providence is going to override that. And some people won't be able to have as many children as they want, and things like that. But in a general sense, it's good to be fruitful, multiply, have large families, like we're saying, and view children that way.
I have a friend. He's actually a journalist. His name is Richard Miniter, and he once iterated to me the idea that most children born with one mouth and one tummy to feed come with two hands. And what he was actually trying to get at in saying that is, we ought not to have a consumerist perspective of children. They too are made in the image of God. They too are a sign of fruitfulness, and they too have the capacity to be fruitful themselves. And you're right. I think in societies that don't have this perception of children, they tend to flounder and eventually die off. Those are destitute cultures, to say the least. Ben, I really appreciate you taking the time to just lend your thoughts to this. I really appreciate you taking the time to write this all-important book, and I hope that it will go far and wide, and that we really will see abortion ended in this country and in many countries around the world. Do you have any final thoughts that you'd like to share? And then at the end of those final thoughts, I'll have you call out our toast as we end this conversation.
Yeah, that sounds good. In terms of final thoughts, I think we hit most of the high notes, but yeah, I certainly just desire that day where abortion is truly abolished. It's going to continue to some extent, illegally, but the vast majority of abortions we can shut down just if lawmakers are doing their duty before God. So, as citizens, we ought to be encouraging our civil officials to do that, and just on a day-to-day basis until that day comes, seeking to rescue those being led away to death. And whether it's sidewalk ministry, whether it's online outreach, whatever the case may be, there's a role all of us can play, and we ought to pursue that in the scriptures, in prayer, going before God and asking him what he would have us do toward that end. So I'd encourage, all of us to just ask that question of God consistently and seek to walk in obedience with that.
Yeah, so good. So good. Ben, you got to show the mug that you've got on camera, because, the people need to see this. So iconic.
Why are you gay? Yeah.
So good. What do you want to toast to today, Ben?
Going to toast to the Christians across this country who are being faithful in this area and just doing unseen work in a lot of cases, trying to just love their neighbors as themselves and obey God and abolish abortion. Let's toast to them.
Cheers.